Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Shroudex. For most of this archive's history, if you asked a longtime reader which SCP-001 they thought was the real one, most of them gave you the same name before you'd even finished the question. Not the sun, not the black moon, not the gate. A single title, whispered across cults, tales, and interrogation transcripts for over a decade of in-universe history. The Scarlet King. And after everything you're about to hear, the strangest part of this file isn't the horror, it's the ending, where an organization spends 2 decades hunting a god and finally catches up to something much smaller and somehow much worse. This channel has covered a sun, an ancient entropic god, the first monster this archive ever wrote, a fourth wall-breaking meta-horror, a salesman, and a bear that only wanted a friend. This file is different from every one of them because it's the only 001 proposal this channel has covered where the scariest part isn't what the entity turns out to be. It's how long it took anyone to actually ask the right question. This entry is credited to an author known on the archive as Tufto, originally written for a community-wide event called the Doomsday Contest back in 2018. That context matters more than it might seem to at first. Most of the 001 proposals this channel has covered were written to introduce a threat for the very first time. This one wasn't. By the time this proposal was published, the Scarlet King had already been referenced, feared, and worshipped across dozens of other tales and files throughout this archive for years. That's a genuinely unusual position for any piece of writing to be in. Imagine finally being handed the official file on a rumor you'd already heard 100 different versions of, from 100 different unreliable narrators, none of whom ever agreed on the details. This proposal was the community's chance to finally see what all of that fear had actually been circling around the entire time. Compare that to every other 001 proposal this channel has broken down. Each of those files had to build its own mythology from a blank page, earning the reader's fear one paragraph at a time. This one inherited its reputation before a single word of the official document was written, arriving already trailing years of half-remembered tales, cult stories, and side references most readers had already stitched together into their own private theory of what this entity actually was. That's also what made this one of the riskiest 001 proposals any author on this archive has ever attempted to write. Every other file competing for this number only has to satisfy readers meeting it for the first time. This one had to satisfy an entire community that had already spent years building its own private version of this entity in the space between the lines of other stories, any one of which could have clashed badly with whatever the official file finally decided to reveal. Here's where this file immediately breaks from almost everything this channel has taught you to expect. Its containment procedures don't describe a cell, a perimeter, or a set of engagement rules. They describe a decision to stop trying entirely. Following a recent extensive investigation, no action is currently required to contain SCP-001 at all. It's described as functionally self-containing, and the file goes further than that, warning explicitly that Foundation interference could actually harm or irreversibly alter whatever fragile containment already exists. Personnel are ordered not to engage with any new matters related to this entry, with one narrow exception for anomalies already in Foundation custody that happen to be connected to it. Think about how rare that instruction actually is across every file this channel has covered. Not just caution, an explicit warning that trying harder might make things worse. After 2 decades of institutional effort, the safest available strategy against SCP-001 turned out to be leaving it alone. Compare that to the locked box test our very first episode on this channel explained. Put the anomaly in a sealed box. If nothing happens, safe. If you don't know, what will happen, Euclid? If it escapes easily, Keter? This file eventually settles into safe, but not because anyone actually built a box strong enough to hold it. It settles there because the Foundation finally learned enough to realize the box was never the right tool for this particular problem in the first place. There's also a specific kind of institutional humility built into that warning, one this channel's orientation episode never really had cause to highlight before now. Most files describe an organization confident in its own methods, certain that enough resources and enough force will eventually solve any problem it's pointed at. This file describes the exact opposite lesson, learned the hard way, after 2 decades of a career and untold institutional resources spent chasing something that was never going to respond to force in the first place. Nobody in this file can say for certain when the Foundation first became aware of this entity. Whatever records might have answered that question were lost during an internal event referred to only as the 1889 Snarling Coup, a piece of the Foundation's own early history significant enough to destroy archives, yet vague enough that the file never explains exactly what happened during it. An investigation was apparently launched shortly afterward, but even that inquiry trails off into a redaction, cut short exactly where the reader most wants it to continue. It's a strange kind of origin story, not missing because nobody wrote it down, missing because something, at some point, made sure it couldn't be read. There's a specific kind of dread built into a redaction that cuts off an investigation into your own organization's founding, rather than an investigation into an external threat. Every other redaction this channel has explained protects a secret about something the Foundation is studying. This one protects a secret about the Foundation itself, at a moment early enough in its history that whatever happened during the Snarling Coup may have shaped the entire institution this channel has spent multiple episodes explaining to you in ways nobody currently working there is cleared to fully understand. According to the file, SCP-001 exists across several alternate dimensions simultaneously, and, crucially, cannot currently enter what the file refers to as the Prime Dimension, the one you and I are sitting in right now, listening to this sentence. That hasn't stopped it from trying. The file states it has been repeatedly attempting entry for a period estimated somewhere between 300 and several thousand years, a genuinely enormous range of uncertainty for a single line in an official document. That vagueness isn't sloppy record-keeping. As you'll hear shortly, it's connected to one of this entity's most unsettling confirmed abilities. It's worth sitting with what it actually means for something to be locked out of reality rather than locked inside a cell. Every other threat this channel has covered exists somewhere reachable, however dangerous that place turns out to be. This one exists everywhere except here, pressed up against the edge of our own dimension for centuries, according to some accounts millennia, testing that boundary the same way water tests a crack in a foundation, patient in a way nothing with a physical body could ever afford to be. That uncertainty about how long it's actually been trying connects directly to the file's own biggest reveal, which we'll get to shortly. For now, simply notice how unusual it is for an official Foundation document to admit this much doubt about something as basic as a timeline. In a file this channel's orientation episode already told you belongs to the single most classified number in the entire archive. Over the years, a variety of organized groups have dedicated themselves to dragging this entity into our reality by force. The most recent and best documented called itself the Children of the Scarlet King, a group finally dismantled in a joint operation between the Foundation and the Global Occult Coalition, our orientation episode's rival organization, in January of 2018. Its former leader, a man named Dipesh Spivak, was taken into Foundation custody, cataloged not as a contained anomaly, but as a person of interest, designation PoI-3172. And it's through him, more than any physical evidence the Foundation ever recovered, that this file's real breakthrough finally happens. It's worth naming what a joint operation between these two organizations actually represents, given everything our orientation episode already told you about how differently they usually operate. The Foundation studies and contains. The Global Occult Coalition frequently prefers to simply destroy what it finds. Two organizations built around fundamentally opposed philosophies chose to work together specifically for this cult, which tells you something about how seriously both sides had come to take the threat, regardless of how that threat would eventually turn out to be understood. It's also worth asking what happens to a movement like this once its central belief is formally reclassified out from under it. Every cult this channel has touched on across previous episodes operates on the assumption that what it worships is real, external, and worth any cost to reach. This file quietly suggests that assumption was never entirely wrong, only badly mistaken about what kind of real it was dealing with, which leaves whatever remains of that movement's true believers in a strange position this file never fully resolves. The researcher at the center of this file is Dr. Robert Montauk, a name the file quietly reveals had already spent close to 20 years working this exact case before we ever meet him on the page. Project lead for nearly 9 of those years, following a procedure he personally devised specifically for handling situations like this one. The recorded exchanges between Montauk and Spivak inside the file read less like a standard Foundation interrogation and more like two exhausted men circling the same unanswerable question from opposite sides of a table. Spivak speaks almost entirely in riddles, refusing anything resembling a direct answer, at one point accusing Montauk of wanting to reduce something sacred into cold, swallowable fact. Montauk, for his part, doesn't hide his own exhaustion. He admits, plainly, to being tired. 2 decades into this assignment, he confesses that every lead he's ever chased on the Scarlet King has led somewhere different. A horned devil here, an ancient blood god there, each version smaller and more disappointing than the myth that came before it. That admission alone reframes the entire file. This isn't a triumphant research breakthrough. It's the sound of a man who has spent most of his career chasing something enormous, quietly beginning to suspect the real answer is going to be a great deal harder to accept than any monster ever could be. There's something worth sitting with in exactly how Spivak frames his refusal to cooperate too. He doesn't claim ignorance. He claims Montauk is asking for the wrong kind of answer entirely, an answer that could be swallowed, understood, and filed away as scientific fact, when whatever he actually believes doesn't work that way. It's a strange kind of standoff, not between someone who knows and someone who doesn't, but between two completely different ideas of what counting as an answer even means. Picture what nearly 20 years on a single case actually does to a person's relationship with the file itself. This channel's orientation episode explained clearance levels, compartmentalization, an organization built to keep any single researcher from holding too much of the truth at once. Montauk represents the opposite extreme, someone who has been allowed, or perhaps forced, to sit closer to this one specific mystery than almost anyone else in the Foundation's entire history, for longer than most careers even last. That proximity doesn't read like power in this file. It reads like exhaustion, the specific kind that comes from spending decades circling the edge of an answer that keeps refusing to resolve. It's worth remembering, too, that this exhaustion belongs to a man our orientation episode's explanation of clearance levels would place well above ordinary field researchers, someone with more direct access to this classified file than almost anyone else in the entire organization. Even that level of access, sustained for nearly 2 decades, wasn't enough on its own. It took one final conversation, one defector's memoir, and a willingness to stop assuming the answer had to look like every other 001 proposal this channel has covered before any of it finally clicked into place. Montauk's interviews aren't the only source this file draws from. A second document preserves an extract from the memoirs of Jack Hurst, a defector from the Children of the Scarlet King, offering a rare first-hand account from inside the cult itself rather than from the Foundation looking in from outside. Between Spivak's riddles and Hurst's recollections, the file slowly assembles something closer to a real answer than any Foundation researcher had managed in over a century of trying, and that answer turns out to be almost nothing like what either the cult or the Foundation had spent all that time preparing for. Notice, too, how deliberately this file balances its two sources against each other. Spivak, still loyal even from inside custody, offering riddles instead of information. Hurst, someone who walked away from that same devotion entirely, offering plain, documented recollection instead. Neither source, on its own, would have been enough to crack this case. It's the friction between unwavering belief and disillusioned memory that finally gives the Foundation something solid enough to build a real theory around. There's also something worth noting about the specific choice to preserve Hearst's account as a memoir rather than a formal interrogation transcript like Spivak's. A memoir implies distance, someone writing after the fact, with time to reconsider what they once believed. That format alone tells you Hearst's relationship to this material had already changed by the time anyone wrote it down. In a way, Spivak's frozen mid-devotion inside an interrogation room never gets the chance to. Here's the reveal this entire file has been building toward, and it's worth hearing exactly as directly as the file itself eventually states it. The Scarlet King was never a singular deity at all. It's something closer to a living idea born specifically alongside the birth of modernity itself, embodying the tension between the pre-modern world and the modern one replacing it. Once that idea existed, the file suggests it didn't stay content simply existing in the present. It reached backward, altering the past to insert itself retroactively into history, manufacturing centuries of myth, worship, and dread that, by this reading, were never really there to begin with until the idea itself decided they should be. That single detail explains the wildly inconsistent timeline this file gave you earlier. 300 years, several thousand. Both figures can be technically accurate at once if the thing being measured is actively rewriting how far back its own history is allowed to stretch, depending on what serves it best in any given moment. It's worth pausing on how genuinely rare a reveal like this is across the entire archive this channel has been documenting. Almost every other entity we've covered turns out to be exactly the kind of thing its file's opening lines suggested it might be. A monster, a god, a phenomenon with physical or quasi-physical properties the Foundation can eventually chart. This file spends years in-universe letting everyone, cultists and researchers alike, assume they're chasing a being. The actual answer belongs to a completely different category of anomaly altogether, closer to the meta-fictional horror this channel covered several episodes ago than to any conventional monster. Sit with what it means for an idea to be capable of retroactively editing its own history too. Every other file in this archive treats the past as fixed, something that already happened and can only be investigated, not altered. This entity breaks that assumption entirely, reaching backward the same way it apparently reaches forward, which means every single historical account of it, anywhere in this archive, in every tale, every side reference, every rumor this channel's audience may have already encountered before tonight, carries a quiet asterisk. Even the version of the past currently on record might not be the same version that existed before this entity decided it should read differently. It's worth sitting with why this specific reveal lands as horror rather than relief. A monster, however powerful, is at least a target. It has edges. It can, in theory, be studied, predicted, eventually cornered. An idea representing the ongoing tension between two entire eras of human civilization doesn't offer any of that. You can't corner a concept. You can't interrogate a feeling shared by millions of people across centuries, even if that feeling happens to have quietly decided to think of itself as a king. It also means the children of the Scarlet King, and every cult before them stretching back through this file's own confused, contradictory history, were never really worshipping a being that existed independently of them. In a very real sense, by this reading, their devotion was part of what kept the idea alive and coherent enough to keep answering when they called. There's a specific kind of vertigo in realizing the hunters and the hunted were never as separate as either side believed. The children of the Scarlet King saw themselves as devoted followers, serving something ancient and external to their own belief. This reveal suggests their devotion wasn't simply directed at something real. It was one of the ingredients keeping that something coherent enough to keep being real. A closed loop between belief and existence that neither the cult nor the Foundation fully understood they were both feeding at the same time. It also raises an uncomfortable question about every other entity this channel has covered, one this file never directly answers, but quietly invites anyway. If enough shared belief, shaped by enough shared fear, is capable of manufacturing something this convincing, how many of the archive's other ancient, half-explained threats might be built out of the exact same material, simply waiting for a researcher patient enough and tired enough to finally ask the right question. Based directly on the results of Dr. Montauk's investigation, the O5 Council made a decision this channel's orientation episode would tell you almost never happens. SCP-001 was formally downgraded from Keter to safe. Sit with how counterintuitive that actually is. Every other file this channel has covered under this number gets more dangerous the more the Foundation learns about it, not less. Here, understanding actually reduced the threat level attached to the file because an idea correctly identified and understood for what it actually is turns out to be far less dangerous than an ancient, unstoppable god nobody could even properly define. That reclassification is, in its own strange way, the single most hopeful moment across every SCP-001 proposal this channel has broken down so far. Knowledge, for once, actually worked exactly the way our orientation episode told you the Foundation's entire mission was built around it working. It's worth naming how rare this specific kind of ending actually is across everything this channel has covered under this number so far. Locke's proposal ends with civilization mostly gone. Tanhony's ends with a burden finally shared after millennia, but never fully resolved. The Gate Guardian never moves, never changes, never gets any less dangerous, no matter how much the Foundation learns about it. This file is the outlier. The threat measurably, officially decreases on paper in a formal vote because the people investigating it finally asked a better question than everyone before them had thought to ask. That doesn't mean the file ends on uncomplicated relief, though. A downgrade to safe doesn't erase 2 decades of a researcher's life spent chasing something that turned out to be smaller and stranger than the myth. It doesn't undo the Snarling Coup or explain what was actually lost in it. It doesn't bring back whatever the children of the Scarlet King sacrificed for a belief that may have been feeding itself rather than something genuinely external to them the entire time. The reclassification is real progress. It just isn't the same thing as a clean ending. There's a final layer worth sitting with before we close this file out. If the Scarlet King really is the tension between the pre-modern and the modern given a name, then in a strange way, this file was never really about a monster at all. It was about the specific discomfort of watching an old world get replaced by a new one, given a face, a title, and eventually an entire cult willing to kill and die in its name. Every civilization this file implies experienced some version of this. Fear has needed a way to name what's being lost when the old certainties stop working. This entity, according to Tufto's proposal, is simply what happens when enough of that unnamed dread accumulates in one place long enough to start answering to a title. It's worth connecting that idea directly back to something this channel's very first episode already told you about how this entire archive got built. We explained that the SCP Wiki emerged from a single anonymous post in 2007, growing into one of the largest collaborative fiction projects on the internet precisely because thousands of separate contributors kept adding their own version of dread to a shared, evolving mythology. This file's central twist, an idea given form purely because enough people needed somewhere to put a feeling, isn't just a clever reveal inside the fiction. It's a fairly accurate description of how the Scarlet King became one of this archive's most iconic threats in the real world, too. One tale, one passing reference, one shared cultural anxiety at a time, long before this specific file ever made it official. So that's SCP-001, Tufto's proposal. The Scarlet King, not a demon, not an ancient blood god, not in the end a being at all. 2 decades of a researcher's career spent chasing something that turned out to be smaller and far stranger than anything he'd been warned to expect. A cult dismantled in a joint operation, a leader speaking only in riddles across a table, a defector's memoir filling in the gaps a Foundation interrogation never could. And underneath every layer of myth, this archive has built up around this one name for over a decade, an idea, old as modernity itself, that simply decided at some point that it deserved a crown. Remember, as always, This is one proposal among dozens competing for the same number. But out of every 001 file this channel has covered so far, this might be the only one that ends with the Foundation actually winning, quietly, and only by finally asking the right question instead of reaching for a bigger weapon. I'm Shroudex. See you in the dark. There's a reason this specific proposal has remained one of the most referenced entries in this entire archive, years after its original publication, longer than most files this channel has covered managed to hold that kind of staying power. It didn't just introduce a threat, it resolved one, quietly, believably, in a way that honored years of accumulated community mythology instead of discarding it, and still managed to land harder than most of the loud, apocalyptic endings this series has shown you so far.